All right. So let's talk about passwords. Boo, I agree. Passwords. Passwords started in computer science in 1961 by a team at the MIT. They had this supercomputer, and it was on a timeshare program. So they had to find a way to bill the different departments so that they could pay for that huge machine. So that was 1961. 1962, there was a password breach. So somebody found a way to access the list, printed it out, gave it to all of his buddies. So it was a mess, and they couldn't invoice the time on the supercomputer anymore. Still, somehow, 50 years later, we're still using passwords, and we haven't learned our lesson yet. And another interesting story, I once took an Uber, and I was in Raleigh, and I was talking with the Uber guy, and he was telling me that he was working in a clinic, and he's been there for 6 months, and he asked me what I do for a living. And yeah, you know, sometimes you don't want to explain exactly what you do, so I said, yeah, I do security on the internet. I was like, oh, you're one of those password guys. I was like, yeah, whatever. Okay, yeah, that's what I do. Like, we do login screens, and he's like, oh, I hate you guys, because you have all those restrictions on password, and I always forget it, and it's annoying. And I was like, oh, yeah, I agree, because, yeah, those restrictions can be really bad, actually. He was like, what do you mean? You're one of those guys. And I said, well, I bet you that your password is name of your clinic with a capital letter, 6 because you've been there for 6 months and you have to change it every 30 days, followed by an exclamation mark because you needed a special character. And he just did a very nervous laugh and changed the subject. He's like, yeah. So passwords suck. Before we start talking about passwords, we'll talk a little bit about me. So very quickly, I'm from Ottawa, Canada. Came all the way down just for this meetup. I'm actually on the Quebec side, hence the charming little accent. Thank you, merci. If you ever want to talk to me, Twitter is always the best way to get a hold of me. So Joel2_Lord. I get super excited whenever I have Twitter notifications. Like, I'll wake up in the middle of the night to answer tweets. So if you have any questions, or even if you just want to send me an animated GIF, I'll be super happy. So by all means, go ahead. I work for this company, Auth0, and I've talked with a few people. I think a lot of you guys know what our company is, but for those who don't, we're an identity management platform as a service. So to simplify it really a lot, if you ever need to build a login screen, then look up our product and we'll take care of all of that. We also manage all the security stuff and so on and so on. I'm a technical evangelist for them, which means that I'm not a good enough programmer to be part of the product team, but it also means that I get to play with the implementation side a lot. So I don't do any security stuff per se. So if you have very specific security questions, I might not be able to answer you, but I know who to redirect your questions to. But I work mostly with the implementation. So I get to try it. I try it on with different frameworks. So I've tried pretty much all the major frameworks in JavaScript in the last 2 years or so. And I learned that, and I go at conferences and I share that information with people. And one of the topics that I've really liked lately is passwordless authentication. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So passwords are bad. We all agree. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. First of all, the cost. The cost of passwords is astronomical. We don't really think about it, but there are so many little things like help desk costs. And we have a customer that saved hundreds and thousands of dollars by switching to a solution like ours. So basically, every time that you need to call a help desk because you forgot your password or you've locked yourself out of a system, a recent research by Forrester said it costs $70, which is not a lot if you have one per day. But if you have thousands of employees, and especially if you're not in a tech sector, they'll call a lot. And it adds up, and it becomes like really, really big numbers. Plus, you also have to make sure that all of your platforms are always secured, that you maintain all of that stuff. We all do that mistake as developers where we implement some sort of a security management system or identity management system. We deploy that, and we don't really look each time there's a new vulnerability that comes out, right? And you have to do that, and that has a cost too. So passwords are very expensive. And of course, breaches. Breaches have a cost too. 2.7 billion records last year that were compromised. And there's only 4% of them that are guaranteed that there's no real information that got out of it. 96% of it is potentially information that is leaked out, the information about you guys. If you're interested into the impact on breaches, there's the website, which is great. They have like so much information. And if you're ever asked to, just do this login stuff and, just do a quick encryption on the password, you can refer people to that. It's like scary shit. So a lot of things, they talk about the cost of breaches a lot. $3.5 million is the average cost for a security breach. They talk about how Yahoo basically lost $350 million on the price of when they got acquired by Verizon. It cost them $350 million because there was a 1.5 billion records that was breached a few weeks before. And of course, there's all the security aspect. Nowadays, because we have access to so much computing power, it gets easier to try to brute force passwords, especially if you don't have very good passwords in place. Social media makes it so easy to do social engineering. Stuff like I said, with the Uber driver, he never confirmed, but I'm pretty sure I had the right password for him. And if you do a little bit of research on people, all of that stuff with the security questions, what's the name of your first pet, what's the name of your mother's maiden name, all of that information can be easily found on a lot of social media. So it's something that we have to keep in mind. And users are always, always, always your weakest link. It doesn't matter how good your security system is, users will screw it up. I don't know if you remember this. So that was when there was like this incident in Hawaii where somebody launched bomb codes or whatever it was, and everybody panicked. So there was an interview with their technical team like a few days afterwards, and there was this post-it with their password for all the security systems in Hawaii right there during a TV interview. Finally, usability. Password sucks, once again. 23% of users admit having only one password, and I think that this is very low. I'm pretty sure it's a lot higher than that. We're a technical crowd here. Who uses the same password on each website? Yeah, not a lot of people are admitting it. I'm sure it's more than that. I know that a lot of my friends, oh, you've got two, that's good. So one for your banking and another one for all the other stuff, right? A lot of my friends are non-technical, and I know they all use the same password. And I always make fun of them, and sometimes I'll hack into their account. They're like, how do you do that? I'm like, really? 60% of users, adult users, have 2 different devices from which they access their information each day. So it makes it really hard to have different passwords, because then you have to remember all of your passwords and so on. So it's also a pain. And we hate them. So I started at Auth0 in January, and one of our policies is that employees must use a password manager. So I got one, installed one, because I was using the same password before that. But I'm slowly changing my password on each site. And in 5 months, I had 157 different records in my password manager. If I were to have to remember all of those, that would be almost impossible. Like 157 randomly generated password, there's no way any human being can remember that. Also, those famous restrictions, which sometimes, I don't know, don't make a lot of sense. This is IHG, and this was very recently. It's like one of the largest hotel chains in North America. And their loyalty program, you have to create a password which is 4 digits. Like really, that's 10,000 combinations.
I had to apply for uninsurance. They use your social security as your username and strict alphanumeric 6-digit password.
6-digit password for, yeah. A lot of places are like that. And actually, I got hacked at IHG, and I lost all of my loyalty points. And I travel a lot, so I had a lot. And I was like, oh. So I called them, and they were actually surprised. And they were like, oh, that's the first time that ever happened. I was like, yeah, I don't think so. 10,000 password, you can brute force that manually in a day. Like, ridiculous. Also, as developers, keep in mind that people are using more and more password managers. So this is a website, and unfortunately, I can't remember which one it was, but I was so frustrated because I randomly generated at least like 10 different passwords, and every single time it was giving me an error message. Minimum 8 characters, at least 1 upper and 1 lower. I was like, I'm pretty sure that's there. But for some reason, special characters stopped, so this one only counted as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 characters, and it kind of stopped at the point. And like, it was the weirdest thing, and it gets really frustrating. And I don't know if that ever happened to you. So you try to log into a website, and you try your password, and it doesn't work, and it's like, oh, maybe it's the one with the capital letter instead. You try that, and it's, oh, maybe capital letter and exclamation mark at the end. Doesn't work either, so you kind of abandon, you go into the forgot password, you go through all of that stuff, and now you enter a new password, very clever one that you've just picked, and you get this. I don't know how many times that happened to me. So passwords suck. I think we're all agree. So what can we do about it? The first thing as a developer is that you have to be aware of this thing called Oauth. So it's an open standard. I'm not sure who's familiar with and who's not, so I'll just talk a little bit about it. But essentially, Oauth is just an open standard that is there. It's kind of a framework on how you should build identity management in your applications. So essentially, you'll have your users, they'll come to your website, and that's one of the different flows, and it's like the simplest one. And I try to stick away from the security vocabulary because I find it's way too dry and there's way too many arrows. So this is a simplified version of it. So users come in, they log into your website. Your website will try to check if the user is authenticated or not. And the important part is right here. So if they're not authenticated, the website will redirect you to the authorization server. And then it will be the job of the authorization server to take care of all of the management of the users. So it will, in this case, give you a login form. The user will put in their credentials. It will validate all of that. And all of the information about the user is stored there. Now, some of that information will be shared through an access token. And that access token can then be used by your application to access some resources on an API. So at a very simple level, that's how Oauth works. But the important part here is really all about the authorization server. So it's only the authorization server that deals with any of the credentials of the user. The other cool part about using something like that is that you can switch those authorization servers. Or you can use that same authorization server for a bunch of different applications, the same way that you would use an API server for a bunch of different frontends. So that's the real power of Oauth, in my opinion. It makes it really easy to put all of your secure stuff in one place. And that's the only server that you need to make sure that is maintained, that is very secure. Well, you should make sure that all of your infrastructure is secure, but you can really focus on that one. But mostly you can delegate that. So you can give that instead of using your own or building your own, and you should never build your own. Who said he was building? Kevin. Never build your own authorization server. Delegate that stuff. So there's a lot of companies out there that will offer you to use their services. So you can use Facebook, you can use Google, or you can use Auth0. So delegate that stuff. It doesn't matter how clever you think you are as a developer. There's no way you're better than the 2,000 security engineers working at Facebook dedicated on that. Like, there's no way. And multi-factor authentication, we all know what it is now. So make sure that you implement that if you're ever implementing your own solutions. But the most important part is that we have to try to forget about that password. We have to try to get out of that mindset. What do I mean when I say, well, forgetting about password? So as users, there's a few little tricks. If you're using the same password, or if you have to, explain to someone that is close to you, your parents, your friends, if you want to tell them, don't use the same password all over the place. There's this cool article about on AVG, which kind of tells you, well, if you want to build a password, create something random, and then just add letters at the end of it. So, for your Facebook, use the same password, but FB, and then for PayPal, same password in PP. It's definitely not the best way, but it's one of the protections. So at least bots, or if somebody picks up a password and they run it through a bot and they try different passwords and different logins, the bot won't find it. If a human reads your password, it will be obvious, and he'll be able to still hack your accounts. but at least it's a way to help other peoples and people that are close to us to not use the same password over and over. Of course, use a password manager. If you don't use one yet, by all means do so. I use 1Password. It's awesome. It uses the Touch ID, so I can just use my fingerprint to unlock it, and it will fill the forms automatically. So really, I have no clue what my passwords are. It's a bunch of randomly generated stuff. And if you ask me for my password for whatever, my bank application, I have no clue what it is. So there's a few free alternatives there. So by all means, look it up, start using them. But we're developers here. So we're interested about how we can change the world, and we have the power to do so. So we have to try to make sure that the users won't have to use those passwords anymore. And that's where I'll talk about alternatives. So there's a few alternatives that you can use. There's the Web Authentication API that just came out very, very recently, just a few weeks ago. If you haven't read about it, very interesting stuff. So it got released in Firefox as well as the latest version of Chrome, so 67, which got installed like earlier today on my machine. And it's a way to generate a set of public-private keys. So you don't need a password anymore, but you can use this public key in order to log into a website. So I was playing with it. There you go. So I was playing a little bit with it, and I've built a small demo version which only uses my local machine for storing all of that stuff. So, I mean, the code is available, but don't use that in production by all means. So you should use a server, a backend that will send you random challenges, and there's a bunch of things that you should do a lot more than that. But just for the sake of having a little bit of a demo and being able to show you how it works, I thought it was interesting to do it locally. So what you need to know about the Authentication API is that there are two methods that are used. So you've got your create method, and you'll pass it the randomly generated challenge that has been created by your server. You'll pass it the user, the name of the user, who's your relying party. There's a bunch of parameters that you'll pass, and documentation is all there on W3C. And then it will simply return you a public key credential that you can use. It's as easy as that. Everything there is just decoding it so that I can actually display it on the screen. And now there's the credentials.get, which you will pass it the challenge once again, and it will just generate you a new public key, so you'll be able to validate if this is one of the allowed public keys or one of the allowed person to access your website. So I went and bought myself two YubiKeys here, and you won't be able to see them really, but so if I try to authenticate, I don't have any users registered at this point, so it's giving me an error. So what I'll try to do is that I'll try to register, and as soon as you click and you use navigator.credentials, you'll see those two little things LED flashing. So I'll just register one, and this is the public key that I get. So I'll share that with my server, and I'll handle this as one of the allowed credentials for this user. Now the server will, next time I'll try to connect, will send me back the allowed keys, and then I'll be able to register by using authenticate again. So doing navigator credentials get, and once again they're flashing. So if I click on this one, it tells me that I have a valid user and I can come in. All right, so I never had to use any password whatsoever. It was all using those two keys, and they're taking care of generating those stuff. I have this other key here, so if I try to access it with a different key, I'm getting a non-authorized because it's not one of the matching keys that are allowed to access this website. Now you could also register multiple keys for a single user, and it looks like that. I'm sorry, I wish I would have made it a little bit prettier, but that's security stuff. It's so boring and dry. But now I can authenticate with the two keys, and it will work. The Web Authentication API uses what they call authenticators to generate those keys. And they will generate something based on the name of the domain. So that's why it really removes any risk of phishing, because it really looks up the real domain name for which it was created. There's other authenticators that are being made right now. So there are some that uses fingerprint or biometrics. So you could use a biometric-based authenticator at this point, but it will all work the same way. They're trying to make it work for your phone as well, so you can use your fingerprint scanner on any website. So the one argument that I hear most of the time when I talk about YubiKeys, because I get really excited about it, is that, yeah, but it's annoying. I don't want to carry a key with me all the time. To which I say, do you have a key for your home in your pocket? Well, we already carry keys, so why not add one? So it's just a key to access all of your digital information. It's no more trouble than carrying your house key or your car key all around. So it's a very interesting solution. There's also very, very tiny YubiKeys that are available, which you can just plug in and you can leave them there and forget about it, which is probably not a very good idea in my opinion, since if you lose your laptop, well, you can't also lose your key. It would kind of be like leaving your key in your house, like in the door when you leave. So biometrics, there's a lot of things coming on. Like I said, using the Web Authentication Api, they're thinking ahead of time, and they're trying to make sure that biometrics will be integrated as part of the standard. So all this should be there. And we're seeing more and more different things. Face ID by Apple, which I'm still a little bit unsure about. Not sure how that will work. It feels like it's an easy way to hack, but you'll see biometrics being used more and more, especially if they have access to a very performant hardware. So I have a global entry card when I travel between US and Canada, and when I come into the US, I have to actually use a fingerprint scanner, which will recognize who I am and give me access or not at the border. And same thing when I come back to Canada, I have a retina scan to do, which will give me access back into the country. So there's always risk with that too, especially if you do face recognition, because anyone could use a picture, of course. So there's a few mechanisms that are in place to try to help with that. And somebody could always chop your fingers and use them, or pop an eye, or whatever. But it's still fairly safe. But it's going to be there in a few years, and we'll definitely see more and more. The one thing which I think is really interesting, and I think we should, as developers, look really seriously into it, is magic links. And we're seeing more and more of those, and I think it's our responsibility as developers to start implementing that. It's a very easy solution to implement, and we should do it. So you might have seen that one in Slack, especially if you're like me. If you use a password manager and you have those randomly generated passwords, you don't know what's your password. So if you have to sign in, sorry. If you have to sign in using the application, then my password manager doesn't work. So I just click on email me a link, it sends me a link in my email, click on it, and I have access to it. So it's super easy to use. I even noticed that Amazon has it, and it must have been really recent. But it happened to me the other day where I was using another machine, and of course I didn't have my password manager installed on it. So I was trying with my phone to enter those 25 characters, and I'm getting older, so it's like, eh. And then I noticed that there was this link, so I just clicked on it, and it sent me a link by email, and I was able to log in. So very, very, very easy to use from a user perspective. So yeah, this is how it works. Yeah, let's lose this. But just to prove my point, yes?
Didn't you have to log into your email to get the link?
I have to log into my email on that machine. It was one of the machines that belonged to me, but I'll come back to that in a minute, if you don't mind. So just to prove my point and show how easy it is, I've built this authentication server, and by all means, don't use it, because I store my passwords in plain text in there. It's not my passwords, demo passwords. But this is a full authentication server, where you can just log in using a password. So basically, you'll have your authorized endpoint in the same fashion that you would have an authorized endpoint on a Oauth server. You'll check if there is an email as part of the request, and you'll do a few checks. I'm just validating the callback here, which is where I'll send my users back after I send a link. And then I'll just randomly create, where is it? I randomly create a token. So I'm using a UUID here, and I'm creating a link. Then I'll store that on my server, and I'll make sure that I remove it after 30 seconds. So the user have 30 seconds to log in with this randomly generated password. This way, it's really hard if you try to use randomly generated, or just if you try to poke around and you try to send different tokens, because they expire after 30 seconds, it's almost impossible to actually find one that will work. And then you simply send that as an email. And that's it. That's all you need to do, really. So very, very simple stuff. A lot easier than actually implementing your own username, password stuff, because you would need to go through all of that encryption process and so on. And then you've got this other endpoint, which is your login, and you pass it your magic link here. And if there's a match, then you'll simply generate a JSON Web Token here and send the JSON Web Token to the user to a specific URL who was specified in the previous endpoint. So what does it look like? So I've got this little application here where, so I've got an API. It's a secured API, so it has a public endpoint, which is the get headline. And it will simply generate a randomly generated clickbait headline. So if I click on it, I'll get something like this. And then I have my awesome headline, which is the same thing, but featuring yours truly. So instead of Taylor Swift. But if I try to access it, it's behind a secured API. So because I don't have an authorization token, I can't access it right now. Got this little kitten there. Oh. OK. So if I try to log in into my application, the only field that I have, once again, is just an email. And it will send me a link. It actually worked. I'm so surprised. All right. And I click on it, and I'm redirected to my application. And I've also sent my access token, which was sent as part of the one of the query parameters, but I remove it as soon as I detect that there's one, so that the user, well, it's there, but the user doesn't really see it. So I got my access token. If I go to jwt.io, I can just paste that in. I get all of the information, so I can see that it's a valid token here. And if I try to get my awesome headline now, it's actually working. All right, how cool is that? Super, super easy to implement. Very easy. You should definitely start doing it. If not as your primary method of authentication, you should definitely try to offer that as an alternative to your users. Much more secure and much easier to both to use and to develop, I think. Now, of course,
how is that more secure than, aren't you just uploading the login process to whoever the email provider is?
it's more secure, and you're right, it's the exact same thing from an infrastructure point of view. The main difference being that your users don't have access to the password. And like I said, your weakest link being your users, by removing that, you remove a big chunk of possible security breaches. You also don't have potential breaches where passwords will be shared and people will have access, and we've probably all looked at haveibeenpwned.com or whatever it is. You know, and one of my passwords was actually breached, and it's right there in plain text, and I can find it. Of course, I don't use that password anymore, but because of that, and because I was reusing that password, it made it dangerous. So if there's just my email that is stored there, then you lose the risk of losing passwords. So that's where it gets a lot more secure. Does that make sense? So now there's always the risk of somebody getting a hold of your email, right? So that's also a real struggle. But on the other hand, I would argue that most websites that I know have a forget password link where you'll just enter in your email and it will send you a link to reset your password. So if somebody has access to your email, you're pretty much screwed anyways. And I said the nice thing about using Oauth is that you can easily switch your authentication server. So you could also use a more secure solution. Like I said, there's a lot of servers that offer stuff like that. In this case, obviously, I'm using Auth0 because they're actually paying for me right now. but it works in the same fashion. Once again, very, very easy to implement, and it will just send you an email, and you have access to your application. And it will actually take care of all the OIDC stuff, asking for your consent to share the data, and so on. So is it secure? Like I said, I think it's secure as long as your email is secure, but the minute that you lose access to your email, there's much more problems than just the magic link in themselves. So what can we expect for the future? What I really hope, at least, is that we're going to see less and less passwords being used. I think one of the big concerns with passwords, as I mentioned, is the users. So they'll forget about it, they'll write it on Post-it, it's so dangerous to use passwords. So hopefully you will all start contributing to diminish the distribution of password by implementing stuff like magic links in your applications. And hopefully you will start seeing cool stuff coming up in the next few years, which I really hope that we will start working on at Auth0, but stuff like having machine learning to kind of detect who you are, or getting a probability of you being a specific user. I'm sure we'll be able to detect patterns and say, yeah, that's definitely Joel because he's been doing that stuff, so I know that it's him so I can authenticate him. So that would be flawless and pretty cool. Not sure how fast we'll see it, though.